By 1988, Pontiac had finally built the Fiero it always promised, a genuine mid-engine sports car with a 2.8-liter V6, a reworked suspension, and zero of the compromises that plagued the original. If you want to see how stories like this end, and why they matter, subscribe to Forgotten Detroit. Then GM killed it. Not because it was failing, not because customers had walked away. The plug was pulled weeks after the best Fiero ever made rolled off the line. That is not a story about corporate incompetence. It is a story about budget wars, internal sabotage, and a car that was set up to fail from the day it was conceived. How does America's most promising sports car get canceled the moment it finally gets good? By the late 1970s, every serious sports car on Earth was mid-engine. Ferrari, Lamborghini, Lotus. The engine sat behind the driver, ahead of the rear axle, and that layout gave those cars a balance and agility that front-engine design simply could not match. American buyers knew it. American car magazines wrote about it constantly. And American automakers had nothing to offer. GM had flirted with the idea before. Pontiac's Banshee concept, a lean two-seat roadster, had been killed internally in the mid-1960s. Not by the market, but by Chevrolet, which saw it as a direct threat to Corvette sales. The lesson Pontiac took was not to stop dreaming. It was to be smarter about how it sold the dream upstairs. Enter Hulki Aldacakti, the Turkish-born engineer GM had assigned to small car development. Aldacakti was not interested in building a show car. He wanted a genuine driver's machine, mid-engine, rear-wheel drive, priced where ordinary people could actually reach it. Something that would put an American badge in a conversation that had been owned by Europeans for a generation. That was the vision. The problem was selling it to a corporation that had already strangled one Pontiac sports car in its crib and was, in 1980, hemorrhaging money through every division. Getting the Fiero approved at all would require a scheme, and that scheme would quietly shape every flaw the car carried for the next 5 years. The scheme Aldacakti and his allies devised was straightforward and ruthless. Do not pitch the Fiero as a sports car. Pitch it as a fuel economy vehicle. It was 1980 and CAFE, corporate average fuel economy, regulations were tightening hard. GM's fleet average had to hit 27.5 miles per gallon by 1985, and every division was scrambling to find lightweight, efficient vehicles that could pull the corporate number upward. Aldacakti recognized that a small two-seat commuter, driven mostly solo, fit that narrative perfectly. So that is exactly what he sold to the 14th floor. Bill Hoagland, Pontiac's general manager, carried the pitch. The Fiero would seat two, sip fuel, and pull double duty as a solo commuter that kept one gas-guzzling family car parked in the driveway. George Miladrag worked the engineering side, keeping the specifications plausible enough that accountants could nod along. The word sports car was not in the room. The approval came through, but with a catch that changed everything. Because GM categorized the Fiero as an economy car, it was funded on an economy car budget. Pontiac received roughly $40 million to develop it. For context, a major new platform at that time typically cost several hundred million. Aldacakti's team had to borrow whatever they could from the existing GM parts bin, suspension geometry, steering components, even brake hardware, from vehicles that had nothing to do with a mid-engine two-seater. Every engineering compromise that would later define the Fiero's reputation, the handling quirks, the thermal problems, the sense that the car never quite became what it wanted to be, traced directly back to that moment of approval. The team got their car. They just got it in a cage built from the lie that made it possible. So what did $40 million actually buy? Pontiac's engineers had to assemble a mid-engine sports car almost entirely from components that already existed inside GM's warehouse. Walk through the build, and the compromises become impossible to ignore. The front suspension came straight from the Chevrolet Chevette, a subcompact economy car with no sporting pretensions whatsoever. The geometry was designed for a front-heavy, front-wheel drive vehicle, and Pontiac adapted it anyway because the dimensions were close enough and the tooling already existed. The rear suspension and transaxle told an even stranger story. Those components originated in GM's X-body front-wheel drive platform, the Citation, the Skylark, the Omega, the Phoenix. Engineers physically flipped the entire assembly and repurposed it for rear-wheel drive mid-engine use. It worked, technically, but it was a workaround layered on top of another workaround. The engine sitting behind the driver was the Iron Duke, a 2.5-liter inline-4, producing around 92 horsepower. GM designed it for economy sedans, where fuel consumption mattered far more than throttle response. In the Fiero, it was mounted in a modified configuration that concentrated heat in ways the original cooling system was never engineered to handle. That thermal problem would not announce itself immediately, but it was already there, baked into the architecture on day one. What Aldecalc's team genuinely built from scratch was the structure underneath all of it. A galvanized steel space frame with bolt-on composite body panels GM called Enduraflex. The panels would not rust, and because they were bolted rather than welded, Pontiac could refresh the car's appearance year to year without retooling the entire body. That was real innovation, and it gave the Fiero its most important asset. It looked exotic. That appearance was enough. The car served as the 1984 Indianapolis 500 pace car. First-year sales cleared 100,000 units, a number that shocked everyone, including GM's own projections. But those sales figures also buried the warning signs sitting directly underneath that striking body. The parts bin engineering was not fixed yet. It was just selling well enough that no one had to admit it. The Iron Duke's thermal problems were not abstract. Two separate failures, arriving together, turned them into a crisis. The first was mechanical. Connecting rods coming out of GM's Saginaw casting plant had a defect rate high enough to matter. A rod could snap under load and punch directly through the engine block, creating an immediate path for oil and heat to meet open air. On their own, those failures would have been serious. But the second problem made every engine on the road more vulnerable than anyone realized. Someone in documentation wrote the Iron Duke's oil capacity as 3 quarts. The correct figure was 4.5. That difference meant technicians across thousands of dealerships were routinely underfilling engines at every service interval. Not by accident, not through negligence, but because the official number was wrong. An engine running 1.5 quarts low on oil runs hotter and degrades faster. Combine chronic low oil with a connecting rod already prone to fracture, and you have a mechanical failure looking for the right moment to happen. The second hazard was electrical, and specific to 1984 models. The C500 wiring harness bulkhead connector was routed directly above the exhaust manifold. Heat migrating off that manifold could melt the connector's insulation. Melted insulation in that location did not just cause electrical faults, it caused fires. GM recalled roughly 125,000 1984 Fieros. In 1987, a subsequent NHTSA campaign covered an additional 244,000 vehicles across model years. When investigators tallied confirmed fire incidents across all 370,168 affected vehicles, the number was 260. That works out to roughly 0.07% of the cars involved. 0.07%. The fires were statistically rare, but a burning sports car photographs dramatically, and news coverage did not traffic in nuance. Each fire reinforced the same story. The Fiero was dangerous. Resale values dropped sharply, and the reputational damage calcified into received wisdom that outlasted every recall, every repair, and every subsequent model improvement. A car that had sold 100,000 units in its first year was now something people warned each other about. Pontiac did not wait for the press to move on. While the recall damage was still fresh, the engineering and product teams were already pushing changes that had been in development for years, and 1985 delivered 2 of the most significant. The first was the 2.8-liter V6. Producing around 135 horsepower, it gave the Fiero a power-to-weight ratio that could finally support the car's visual promises. 0 to 60 dropped into the mid-7-second range. That is not exotic territory, but it is credible performance, the kind that makes a driver feel the car is working with them rather than against them. The second was the fastback GT body style. Where the original notchback read as compact and tidy, the GT pulled the roofline down into a long, unbroken arc that made the car look genuinely Italian from the right angle. Pontiac had always been selling an image. Now the shape was sharper. What made incremental improvement practical was something baked into the Fiero's original engineering: composite body panels. Because the exterior was plastic rather than stamped steel, restyling a section of the car did not require retooling an entire production line. Pontiac used that flexibility deliberately, updating hood profiles, fascias, and trim details across model years, at a cost that conventional steel-bodied cars could not have absorbed. A 1985 Motor Trend survey put a number on what all of this was responding to. 83% of Fiero buyers said styling was their primary reason for purchase. Pontiac read that correctly. The car's looks were carrying the sale, which meant anything that undermined confidence in the driving experience was a direct threat to the whole proposition. Closing the gap between how the car looked and how it performed was not optional. By 1987, the suspension had been substantially revised and the interior had been upgraded. The Fiero that existed at the end of that year was a meaningfully better car than the one that had launched 4 years earlier, which made what happened next particularly brutal. By 1988, Pontiac's engineers had finally run out of patience with compromise. What they delivered that model year was not another round of incremental updates. It was a ground-up mechanical rethink of everything underneath the car. The front suspension received revised geometry, designed specifically for the Fiero's weight distribution and driving dynamics. The rear was replaced entirely. A new multi-link layout engineered from scratch for a mid-engine, rear-wheel drive platform. Every borrowed component from the GMX body that had haunted the car since launch was gone. Vented disc brakes were added at all 4 corners. This was the chassis the original concept had always required, and it took 4 years of production to get there. One myth worth killing here: this suspension is sometimes called the Lotus design. It was not. Lotus did consult with GM during this period on other projects, but the 1988 Fiero's suspension was a Pontiac and GM engineering effort. Most of the new components do not interchange with earlier cars, which tells you exactly how complete the redesign was. The drivetrain matched the chassis. The 2.8-liter V6 carried over, but now with multi-port fuel injection, pushing output to between 135 and 140 horsepower and approximately 165 to 170 pound-feet of torque. The GT stickered at $13,999, putting it directly against the Toyota MR2 in both price and specification. The automotive press noticed immediately. Road tests that had spent years documenting the gap between the Fiero's looks and its behavior could finally write something different. The car tracked cleanly, rotated predictably, and stopped hard. It drove the way it had always appeared it should. So here is the part that still doesn't sit right. Pontiac's engineers had taken a flawed but promising platform, fixed its fundamental mechanical problems, and produced a genuine sports car at a competitive price point, in one of the most image-sensitive segments in the American market. The press validated it. The bones were there for a second generation that could have been genuinely dangerous to European competition. GM killed the Fiero at the end of the 1988 model year. Here is what actually ended the Fiero, and it is less dramatic than most people want it to be. In 1984, GM sold over 100,000 Fieros. By 1987, that number had collapsed to 46,581, less than 20% of the plant's designed capacity. The fire scandal had poisoned the used car market, scared off buyers who might have replaced their first one, and planted doubt in people who had never owned the car at all. None of that was reversed by an improved suspension or better fuel injection, because most buyers never got close enough to notice the improvements. That sales volume created a specific production problem. The Fiero's body required a specialized 2-story custom drill and milling machine, a fixed cost that only justified itself at high volume. When you are running a plant designed for 100,000 units and shipping fewer than 50,000, that machine is hemorrhaging money whether it runs or not. Pontiac could not price the car higher without losing ground to the MR2. They could not cut costs without compromising the engineering they had just finished getting right. Corporate priorities made the arithmetic worse. GM's internal projections showed the 2-seat sports car segment softening. The Corvette held protected status as the corporation's performance flagship, and a second mid-engine sports car eating into that identity was not something the 14th floor had any interest in funding through a second generation. Resources were finite, and the Fiero's case on paper, with those sales figures, was not strong enough to win that argument. So GM did the math and canceled it. Not a conspiracy, not executive sabotage, not Corvette engineers pulling strings in the night. A corporation looked at a declining revenue line, a fixed cost production problem, a softening market forecast, and a protected internal competitor, and it made the decision that corporations make. The genuine tragedy is the timing. The problems that killed the car's reputation were already fixed. The buyers just never came back to find out. Here is what GM's engineers were quietly building while the accountants were running those cancellation numbers. John Chinella's design team had already begun second-generation development before the first-generation car finished its production run. Two proposed powertrains were on the table, a 16-valve four-cylinder and a turbocharged V6. Either one would have repositioned the Fiero from a sporty commuter into a genuine performance machine. More striking is what GM did on the engineering side. They brought in Porsche to collaborate on chassis and handling development for the second generation. Internally, the target was described as a car competitive with Ferrari and Porsche. That is not marketing language from a press release. That is an internal engineering benchmark. 3 physical concepts document how far the program progressed. In 1986, Pontiac built a gold convertible Fiero for road shows, a running car, not a static model. In 1988, an extended wheelbase 2+2 concept explored whether the platform could carry rear passengers without collapsing the mid-engine proportions. Then in 1990, 2 years after the production line closed, the Fiero GT concept appeared, a car that blended Fiero and Firebird styling into something that looked like it belonged in a different decade entirely. One running prototype of that concept was built and is believed to be in private hands today. None of these cars entered production. The final Fiero rolled off the line in August of 1988. Total production across all model years, 370,168 units. What makes the prototype record painful is the timeline. Chinella's team was not speculating about what the Fiero could become. They were engineering it. The Porsche collaboration was not a brainstorming exercise. GM had the roadmap and the partners to build a world-class sports car on a platform they already owned. The cancellation did not just end the Fiero. It erased the version that would have made everyone forget the fires. GM did not cancel a failing experiment. They canceled a car that Porsche had helped engineer, with turbocharged power on the drawing board and a Ferrari benchmark written into the internal brief. That is the fact that sits at the center of the Fiero's story. What followed the cancellation was not silence. Today, the Fiero has one of the most active enthusiast communities of any discontinued American car. Owners swapping engines, restoring originals, and in some cases, completing the performance vision the factory never finished. The collector market treats the 1988 models, the last and most refined, as the ones worth chasing. The broader lesson is about corporate structure. The Fiero was not killed by bad engineering. It was killed by a budget process that could not wait 18 months for the evidence to arrive. Does a car's story end when production stops? The Fiero's answer is obvious. If you owned one, wrenched on one, or just always wanted to, tell me in the comments. And if this video gave you something, subscribe and like so the next one finds you. Thanks for watching.